The evacuation order came through at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday afternoon that would be the last ordinary moment in Strike's career with the Foundation. She was reviewing structural blueprints in Site 19 when her secure terminal chimed with the priority alert. Blackwood Tower. Those two words were enough to make her coffee go cold in her hand. Strike had been with the Foundation's Architectural Anomalies Division for 11 years. She'd seen buildings that existed in more dimensions than should be possible, stairwells that aged you backward with each step, and a parking garage in Minnesota that occasionally connected to a parallel Earth where the Nazis had won. But Blackwood Tower was different. Blackwood Tower was personal. The briefing was already underway when she arrived at the Tactical Operations Center. Director Chen stood at the front of the room, her face illuminated by the glow of satellite imagery showing a sleek glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Seattle. 43 stories of modern architecture that looked utterly mundane from the outside. That was the problem with Adrian Blackwood's work. It always looked normal until you were inside. "We have approximately 230 civilians trapped inside," Director Chen said without preamble. The building entered an active phase 17 minutes ago. All electronic communication with the interior has ceased. Witnesses report doors sealing themselves and elevators becoming non-functional. "We're deploying 3 extraction teams. Strike, you'll be leading Team Alpha." Strike nodded, already mentally cataloging what they'd need. Demolition charges, climbing equipment, portable reality anchors, the works. Around her, other specialists were being briefed on their roles. Dr. Yates from Temporal Mechanics, Agent Morrison from Mobile Task Force Epsilon 6, known colloquially as Village Idiots for their specialization in architectural anomalies, and 6 D-Class personnel whose files Strike deliberately didn't read. She never read the D-Class files before an operation anymore. It made the inevitable losses harder. "Strike," Director Chen said, catching her as the briefing broke up. "I know your history with Blackwood's work. If you need to recuse yourself from this operation..." "I'm the best structural engineer you have for this," Strike interrupted. "And I've been inside 3 of his buildings and come out alive. No one else can say that." Chen studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Wheels up in 20 minutes. And Strike, the building is already showing signs of entering what we're calling Phase 2. We estimate you have 90 minutes before it becomes completely impassable. After that..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The helicopter ride to Seattle took 47 minutes. Strike spent the time reviewing everything the Foundation knew about Adrian Blackwood, though she practically had it memorized. Architect, artist, madman. He'd appeared in the architectural world in 1987 with a series of impossible designs that should never have been structurally sound. Buildings that seemed to defy basic physics. At first, people thought he was just a talented designer who understood materials in innovative ways. Then the incident started. The first was a community center in Portland. Nothing dramatic. People just started reporting that they'd get lost in hallways they'd walk down 100 times. Rooms that seemed to shift position. A janitor who swore he'd climbed the same stairwell for 3 hours without reaching the top. The Foundation had investigated, found minor spatial distortions, and classified it as safe. An architectural curiosity, nothing more. Then came the office building in Vancouver. 12 people died when the interior decided to fold itself into a configuration that crushed everyone on the 4th floor into a space roughly the size of a shoebox. The Foundation had locked that one down hard, demolished it, and started hunting for Blackwood. They'd found him in a cabin in northern Montana, surrounded by blueprints and architectural drawings that hurt to look at. Plans for buildings that existed in geometries the human mind wasn't meant to process. He'd been cooperative, almost eager to explain his work. He'd found something, he said, a mathematical principle that allowed spaces to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Architecture that was alive, that could think, that could evolve. He died in Foundation custody 3 years ago. Heart attack, officially. But his buildings remained, and they were waking up. The helicopter set down in a parking lot 2 blocks from Blackwood Tower. Strike could see the building from here, gleaming in the afternoon sun. It looked so normal. That was what made Blackwood's work truly terrifying. It didn't announce itself with tentacles or impossible angles visible from the outside. It waited until you were inside, until you were committed, and then it showed you what it really was. Team Alpha assembled quickly. Agent Morrison, tall and scarred from a dozen architectural anomaly encounters. Dr. Yates, nervous and brilliant, clutching a portable Kant counter that measured local reality stability. The 6 D-class personnel dressed in standard orange jumpsuits, their faces showing varying degrees of fear and resignation. And Strike herself, carrying enough climbing gear and demolition supplies to evacuate a small army. "Our entry point is the main lobby," Strike said, gathering everyone around a hastily erected command table. "Standard extraction protocol. We move floor by floor, gathering civilians and guiding them to exits. The building's spatial distortions seem to follow Blackwood's typical patterns, recursive loops, non-Euclidean transitions between floors, and what we call predatory architecture. The building will try to isolate us. Stay in visual contact with your buddy at all times. If the geometry starts shifting, mark your path with spray paint and follow the marks back." Questions? One of the D-class personnel, a thin man with a shaved head, raised his hand. "What happens if we get separated?" Strike met his eyes. "Don't get separated." They approached the building on foot. The streets around Blackwood Tower had been cleared by local law enforcement under the guise of a gas leak. Good. The last thing they needed was civilians trying to mount their own rescue operations. Strike could see faces pressed against windows on the upper floors. People who had no idea that the building around them was slowly waking up to the fact that it was hungry. The lobby doors were glass and chrome, perfectly ordinary. They slid open with a soft hiss as the team approached. Strike stepped through first and immediately felt the change. The air inside was different, thicker somehow. The Kant counter in Dr. Yates's hands began clicking softly, measuring reality fluctuations too subtle for human senses to detect. "Reading 0.73 Humes," Yates said quietly. "That's lower than baseline. We're already in an area of reduced reality stability." The lobby looked like any modern office building. Marble floors, a reception desk, a bank of elevators along the far wall. A directory listed companies Strike had never heard of. Probably shell corporations the Foundation had created to maintain the building's cover. But there were signs if you knew where to look. The elevator doors were sealed shut, not just closed but sealed, as if they'd never been meant to open. The emergency exit signs pointed in directions that didn't quite match the actual layout of the room, and the shadows fell wrong, angling from light sources that didn't exist. "Team Bravo and Charlie are entering through the service entrances," Morrison said, touching his radio. "They're reporting similar conditions. No civilians in the lower levels yet. Everyone seems to have moved upward." Of course they had. When people get trapped, they instinctively seek higher ground. It was basic human psychology. Unfortunately, in a Blackwood building, higher usually meant deeper into the anomaly. Strike led the team to the emergency stairwell. The door opened normally, revealing a concrete staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Standard issue, nothing unusual. Yet, she stepped through, marking the doorframe with a bright orange X from her spray paint can. Behind her, the rest of the team followed, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. They climbed to the second floor. The door here was labeled clearly. Second floor, offices. Strike opened it slowly, revealing a long corridor lined with office doors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Everything looked normal. Too normal. "Kant counter?" she asked. 0.65 Humes and dropping, Yates replied. "We're moving deeper into the distortion field." They moved down the corridor, checking offices. Most were empty, showing signs of hasty evacuation. Computers still running, coffee cups half full, jackets draped over chairs, but no people. Strike marked their path with X's every 10 feet, creating a trail they could follow back. At the end of the corridor, they found the first civilian. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a business suit, huddled under a desk. She looked up as Strike approached, her eyes wide with terror. "Thank God," the woman breathed. "I've been trying to get out for hours. The building, something's wrong with the building." "We know," Strike said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I'm with a specialized rescue team. We're going to get you out. What's your name?" Sarah Chen. I work in accounting on the 4th floor, but I came down here in the stairs. They don't work right. I kept going down, but I ended up going up. And the hallways, they're... It's okay, Strike interrupted gently. We understand what's happening. Stay with us, stay close, and we'll get you out. They collected Sarah Chen and continued their sweep. Third floor, 2 more civilians, both men who worked in IT. Fourth floor, empty. Fifth floor, a group of 7 people who'd barricaded themselves in a conference room. Strike marked each location, building a mental map of the building's layout. So far, everything was following normal architectural logic, but she knew it wouldn't last. It was on the 8th floor that things started to change. The stairwell door opened onto a corridor that looked identical to the one on the 2nd floor. Same layout, same fluorescent lights, same office doors. But when Strike checked her compass, it spun lazily without settling on any particular direction. Magnetic north had ceased to have meaning. Kant counter reading .42 Humes, Yates said, his voice tight with tension. We've crossed into significant reality distortion. The local physics are becoming increasingly negotiable. Strike led the team down the corridor, spray painting her marks. They checked offices, finding 3 more civilians. But when they reached the end of the hallway, where the stairwell door should have been, they found only a wall. Solid concrete, as if the door had never existed. That's impossible, Morrison muttered. We just came through that door 5 minutes ago. Nothing's impossible in a Blackwood building, Strike replied, already assessing their options. The spatial layout is starting to shift. We need to move faster. She led them back the way they'd come, following the orange X's. But after the 4th mark, the corridor simply ended. Not in a wall or a door, but in empty space. The hallway just stopped, opening onto a vast darkness that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Strike could feel air moving in that darkness, a cold wind that smelled of concrete dust and something else. Something organic. Back, she ordered. Different route. They retreated, trying a side corridor. This one led to a door marked Stairwell B. Strike opened it carefully, revealing stairs that descended at an angle that made her eyes hurt. The steps seemed to curve in ways that weren't quite right, following a geometry that her brain struggled to process. Is it safe? Asked one of the D-class personnel, a young woman named Rivera. No, Strike answered honestly, but it's our best option. They descended carefully, each step requiring concentration to place correctly. The stairs seemed to shift subtly as they moved, the angles changing just enough to throw off balance. Halfway down, Dr. Yates stumbled, and Morrison caught him before he could fall into the darkness below. Below. That was assuming there was a below. Strike wasn't sure anymore. The stairs eventually opened onto what should have been the 7th floor, but the corridor here was different. The walls were closer together, the ceiling lower, and the doors along the hallway were all identical, repeating in a pattern that extended far beyond what the building's external dimensions should allow. Strike checked her watch. They'd been inside for 43 minutes. The civilians they'd collected numbered 18 now, a frightened group that stayed close to the team. Too many to move quickly, but Strike couldn't justify leaving anyone behind. Not yet. We need to find a working stairwell, she said. The building is actively shifting now. Our window for extraction is closing. They tried 3 more corridors, each one leading to dead ends or impossible spaces. In one, they found a room that seemed to extend upward forever, the ceiling lost in distant darkness. In another, the floor was transparent, revealing the lobby 40 stories below, but there was no way down. The building was playing with them, Strike realized, showing them exits they couldn't reach, teasing them with glimpses of escape. It was Morrison who noticed the pattern. The orange marks, he said suddenly. Look at them. Strike looked. The X's she'd been spray painting were moving. Slowly, subtly, they were sliding along the walls like living things, rearranging themselves into patterns that weren't the ones she'd created. The building is learning our navigation system, Yates said, his voice filled with horrified fascination. It's adapting to our countermeasures. Strike felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was new behavior, more sophisticated than anything they'd documented in Blackwood's other structures. The building wasn't just anomalous architecture anymore, it was actively intelligent. New plan, she said. We stopped trying to navigate normally. Blackwood buildings follow their own internal logic. We need to figure out what this one wants. Wants? Rivera asked. Buildings don't want things. Blackwood's buildings do, Strike replied. They're designed with a purpose, even if that purpose doesn't make sense to us. This one has been passively containing people for years. Now it's gone active. There's a reason. She thought back to her briefings on Blackwood's philosophy. He'd talked about buildings as living organisms, structures that could grow and evolve. He'd been particularly obsessed with the concept of digestion, of spaces that could process and transform what they contained. The digestive phase, Strike said quietly. Director Chen mentioned it in the briefing. The building isn't just trapping us, it's trying to break us down. As if in response to her words, the walls around them groaned. Not the normal settling sounds of a building, but something organic, something alive. The corridor began to narrow, the walls sliding inward with glacial slowness. A centimeter every few seconds, barely noticeable until Strike put her hand against the wall and felt it pushing back. Move, she ordered. Everyone, move now. They ran, the civilians crying out in fear as the reality of their situation finally broke through shock and denial. The corridor seemed to stretch as they ran, the exit door receding faster than they could approach it. Classic Blackwood geometry. Distance became relative, space became negotiable. Strike stopped running. Everyone stop! The team skidded to a halt, confused. The corridor continued to narrow around them, now barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. We're playing its game, Strike said. Running toward the exit means we'll never reach it. The building responds to intent. We need to do something it doesn't expect. She turned and walked backward, away from the exit, deeper into the narrowing corridor. The walls continued to close, but the exit door stopped receding. After 5 steps, she turned and walked forward again. The door was closer now. It's like a Chinese finger trap, Yates said with sudden understanding. The more you struggle, the tighter it holds. We need to move counter to our instincts. They proceeded this way, advancing and retreating in a strange dance that somehow brought them closer to the door. The civilians followed, confused but desperate. Behind them, the corridor continued to narrow, the walls now close enough that Strike could touch both sides at once. They reached the door just as the corridor became impassable. Strike pushed through, and they tumbled into a stairwell that seemed blessedly normal. But she knew it wouldn't last. Status report, she said, checking her team. Everyone was accounted for, though several of the civilians were approaching panic. Her radio crackled, and she heard Morrison trying to raise teams Bravo and Charlie. Static answered him. We've lost contact with the other teams, Morrison reported. Could be interference from the spatial distortions, or the building has isolated us, Strike finished. It's what I'd do if I were a predatory structure, divide and conquer. They climbed the stairwell, because down no longer seemed to lead toward exits. The stairs spiraled upward in a configuration that Strike's engineer brain recognized as structurally impossible. They were climbing at a 45-degree angle, but somehow also moving horizontally. The building was folding space like origami, creating paths that existed in multiple orientations simultaneously. On what should have been the 15th floor, they found more civilians, a group of 12, including 2 children who'd been visiting their mother's office. The children were crying, and Strike felt her professional detachment crack slightly. Kids. Blackwood had never put kids in his buildings before. Or maybe he had, and they'd just never survived long enough to be counted. We're getting everyone out, she told the children's mother, a woman with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. I promise. It was a promise she shouldn't make. Promises in this work were dangerous things, but sometimes people needed to hear them anyway. The group numbered 30 now, too large to move efficiently. Strike made the decision to split up, against every protocol and instinct. Morrison would take half the civilians and continue searching for an exit route. Strike would take the rest and try to reach the upper floors, where intel suggested a large group had gathered. They separated at a junction of 3 corridors, each leading in a different direction. Strike watched Morrison's group disappear down the left passage, then led her own team right. She didn't let herself think about the odds of seeing him again. The upper floors were where the building's true nature revealed itself. The walls here were breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that mimicked lungs. The floor felt soft underfoot, almost spongy, and the geometry had abandoned any pretense of following normal physical laws. Corridors intersected at angles that shouldn't exist. Doors opened onto rooms that were somehow larger than the entire building. Gravity became a suggestion rather than a rule, pulling in different directions depending on where you stood. Strike found the large group on what her compass insisted was the 23rd floor, though she'd long since lost track of their actual position. 67 people packed into a space that looked like it had once been a cafeteria. They'd barricaded the doors with tables and chairs, as if that could keep out the building itself. A man who identified himself as building security met Strike at the barricade. "Thank God. We've been trapped here for over an hour. The elevators stopped working, and every time we try to use the stairs, they lead us back here. It's like the building won't let us leave." "It won't," Strike said. "Not without help. I'm with a specialized rescue team. We're going to get you out, but you need to follow my instructions exactly. The building's spatial layout is compromised. Normal navigation doesn't work anymore." She organized the civilians into groups of 10, assigned each group a team member to follow. Dr. Yates would lead one group. Each of the D-class personnel would lead others. Strike would take point with the first group and try to find a path that the building would allow them to follow. They left the cafeteria in a long line, moving like a chain of paper dolls through corridors that shifted and changed around them. Strike marked their path not with spray paint anymore. The building had learned that trick, but with small reality anchors, devices that pinned local space into a stable configuration. They were expensive and in short supply, but they created brief islands of normalcy in the chaos. The building fought them. Doors sealed themselves, corridors became mazes, stairwells led in circles. But Strike had been studying Blackwood's work for 11 years, and she'd learned to think like his buildings thought. She looked for the paths that seemed wrong, the doors that appeared to lead nowhere. Those were often the real exits, hidden in plain sight. They descended through impossible geometry, moving down stairs that led up, through doors that opened into spaces they'd already left. Strike's sense of direction had long since given up, but she followed her instincts and the readings on Yates's Kant counter. Areas of higher reality stability meant they were moving toward the building's edges, toward the boundary between the anomaly and normal space. On what she hoped was the 3rd floor, they found Agent Morrison and his group. He looked haggard, his uniform torn, but everyone was still alive. "We've been going in circles for 40 minutes, he reported. "Every route leads back to the same corridor." "The building is hurting us," Strike realized. "It's controlling our movement, pushing us toward something." "Toward what?" Strike didn't answer because she just figured it out. The digestive phase. The building wasn't trying to keep them trapped forever. It was gathering them all together, consolidating them into a smaller and smaller space. And then it would compress that space, the same way it had done to the 4th floor of the Vancouver building. 12 people crushed into a shoebox-sized area, but this time it would be over 100 victims. "We need to reach the lobby now," she said. "No more careful navigation. We push through, consequences be damned." She led them to the nearest stairwell and descended at a run. The stairs fought them, shifting and changing, but Strike didn't let the group slow down. They crashed through doors, ignored dead ends by blasting through walls with her carefully hoarded demolition charges. The building groaned around them, the organic sounds growing louder, more urgent. They burst into the lobby after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Strike felt a surge of relief at the sight of the marble floors, the chrome and glass. And then she saw the exits. Where the lobby doors should have been, there was only concrete, solid, featureless concrete, as if the building had never had exits at all. The windows showed the outside world, Seattle's skyline visible in the afternoon sun. But when Strike touched the glass, it was solid. Not glass anymore, but something that looked like glass and felt like steel. "No," one of the civilians whispered. "No, no, no." The lobby began to change. The ceiling lowered, dropping inch by inch. The walls moved inward. The building was entering its final phase, compressing the space, preparing to crush everything inside. Strike's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Blackwood always left a way out, hidden in his designs. It was part of his philosophy. Buildings should be puzzles, challenges to solve. She thought about his notes, his drawings, his endless theories about architecture as a living art. And then she remembered something he'd said during his Foundation interview, words she'd read a dozen times in the transcripts. A building is a relationship between inside and outside. The entrance is where that relationship begins, but it's not the only point of contact. The entrance wasn't the only way out. There were other points where the building touched the outside world. Utilities, infrastructure, the systems that connected the building to the city around it. The basement, Strike said. We need to get to the basement. The water mains, the electrical conduits, they have to connect to external systems. If we can breach those connections... She didn't finish the sentence. The ceiling was now low enough that the tallest people had to duck. They had minutes at most. Strike led the desperate scramble to find basement access. The lobby's normal stairwell had sealed itself, but she found a maintenance door behind the reception desk. It opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The group poured through, civilians crying and praying as the space behind them continued to compress. The basement was a maze of pipes and conduits, dimly lit by emergency lighting. Strike could hear water rushing through pipes, electrical hum from transformers, real connections to the outside world. She pulled out her last demolition charge, a heavy-duty breaker designed for reinforced concrete. "Everyone back," she ordered, placing the charge against what she hoped was an external wall. The building groaned around them, the basement ceiling beginning to lower. They were out of time. She triggered the charge. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Concrete shattered, revealing not the outside world, but another layer of wall. Strike felt despair rising. And then water began pouring through the cracks. Real water, cold and clean, from Seattle's municipal system. A connection to the outside. She grabbed a pipe wrench from a nearby tool rack and began hammering at the broken concrete, widening the breach. Others joined her, using tools and bare hands to tear through the wall. The ceiling was now barely 6 feet high, dropping faster. People were screaming. Strike kept hammering, kept tearing, kept refusing to accept that this was how it ended. The wall gave way. They burst through into a utility tunnel that ran beneath the city streets, a concrete corridor filled with pipes and cables. Real space, stable space, normal space. Strike counted heads as people poured through the breach, making sure everyone made it. Morrison came through last, dragging Dr. Yates, who'd twisted his ankle in the rush. Behind them, through the breach, they could see the basement compressing, the ceiling and floor rushing together like closing jaws. And then the breach itself sealed over, concrete flowing like liquid to repair the damage they'd caused. The building closed itself, sealing off the connection they'd exploited. Strike led the group through the utility tunnel to a maintenance access ladder. They climbed up, emerging through a manhole cover 2 blocks from Blackwood Tower. Fresh air, sunlight, the ordinary world. Foundation personnel were waiting, including Director Chen, who looked both relieved and exhausted. "Status?" Chen asked. "All 3 teams accounted for," Strike reported, her voice hoarse. 137 civilians extracted, no casualties. It felt like a miracle. It probably was a miracle. She turned to look back at Blackwood Tower. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, gleaming glass and steel, just another skyscraper in Seattle's downtown. But Strike knew what it really was now. Not just an anomalous building, but something alive and hungry, something that had been patient for years and was only now revealing its true nature. "We need to demolish it," she said, "before it tries this again." Director Chen nodded slowly. "Authorization is already being processed. But Strike, you should know, we've confirmed activity at 7 other Blackwood structures. Whatever triggered this one, it's happening to all of them simultaneously. They're all waking up." Strike felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. 7 buildings, hundreds, maybe thousands of potential victims. And she was the Foundation's best expert on navigating Blackwood's impossible architecture. "Then we'd better get to work," she said. The Blackwood Tower was demolished 3 days later, brought down in a carefully controlled implosion that reduced it to rubble. Foundation researchers sifted through the debris, looking for clues about how the building's anomalous properties functioned. They found architectural drawings etched into the building's structural steel, mathematical formulas that described geometries that shouldn't exist, and what appeared to be a nervous system made of copper wire threaded through the concrete. Strike wrote her report in the week following the evacuation. She detailed the building's progression through its active phases, the way it had adapted to their countermeasures, the intelligence it had demonstrated. She made recommendations for handling the other Blackwood structures, protocols for evacuation and containment. But late at night, alone in her quarters at Site 19, she thought about what Adrian Blackwood had said in his final interview before he died. The one that hadn't been included in the official files, the one she'd had to dig through archives to find. Buildings outlive their architects, Blackwood had said. That's the point of architecture, isn't it? To create something that persists, that grows, that becomes more than its creator intended. I've given the world living spaces in the most literal sense, and they'll keep living long after I'm gone. They'll learn, they'll evolve, they'll become what they were always meant to be. The interviewer had asked what that was. What were Blackwood's buildings meant to become? Blackwood had smiled. Hungry, he'd said. Strike closed the file and looked out her window at the Site 19 compound. Safe, secure, protected, for now. But somewhere out there, 6 more Blackwood buildings were waking up, learning, evolving. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who'd spent years studying his work, that they were only seeing the beginning. The Foundation would contain them. They always did. But containment wasn't the same as victory. And in the case of Adrian Blackwood's legacy, Strike suspected that victory might not be possible. Only survival, measured one evacuation at a time, one building at a time, until either the buildings or the Foundation finally won. She filed her report and requested assignment to the next Blackwood extraction. Director Chen approved it within the hour. Strike packed her gear, climbing equipment, demolition charges, reality anchors, and spray paint that she now knew was useless, and prepared to do it all again. Because that was the job. That was what the Foundation did. They protected humanity from the anomalous, the impossible, the things that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Even when those things were buildings designed by a dead architect who'd figured out how to make structures that could think and hunger and kill. Especially then. Strike left Site 19 the next morning, headed for Portland, where another Blackwood building was showing signs of entering its active phase. She didn't let herself think about the odds, about the fact that eventually her luck would run out, that eventually she'd be trapped in a corridor that compressed too fast, or a stairwell that led nowhere, or a room that decided to digest her along with everyone else inside. She thought instead about the civilians she'd saved, the 137 people who'd gone home to their families because she'd figured out Blackwood's puzzle in time. That had to be enough. In this job, it had to be. Behind her, unknown and unnoticed, a maintenance worker at Site 19 complained about a new office building that seemed to have hallways that were longer than they should be. The complaint was filed, investigated, and dismissed as normal perception issues. The building had been designed by a small architectural firm in Seattle. The lead architect had trained under Adrian Blackwood in the early 1990s, before Blackwood's work had been classified. He'd learned from the master, absorbed the principles, and started creating his own designs. The Foundation would eventually notice. They always did. But by then, the building would be occupied, inhabited, lived in, and it would be hungry. That was how legacies worked. They spread, they persisted, they grew. Adrian Blackwood had understood that better than anyone. His buildings would outlive him, and they would keep teaching the Foundation the same lesson, over and over, one evacuation at a time. Architecture could be art, could be science, could be mathematics made manifest in steel and concrete. But in Blackwood's hands, it had become something else entirely. It had become alive.